Thank you very much, Joanne. I have to say, zippity-doo-dah, it's great to be back in Vigo. I really enjoy it, and it's even better that I've been invited back by a group of scientists that I view as my friends, so thank you, Fresh. SSB still rules. I wasn't quite sure when I was invited what I was going to talk about or how I was going to create this talk. So I went around a lot of my friends at the institute that I work with, Cindy Van Dam, Thomas Brunel, Jan-Jaap Poos, Adrian Reinsdorp, and then some of my collaborating scientists, Richard Nass, Jago, and Laurie Kell, to ask them their views and their thoughts about what I should talk about. So here, as you see, I've been quite subtle. I've said with rather than and, because in fact, some of these authors haven't actually seen this talk at all, but I've used their views as inspiration. Okay, I think this whole issue relates back to a very simple concept that Tara Marshall kicked off in 1998 with this paper, has been cited quite a few times, that the SSB does not really equal stock productivity. It's perhaps not the best index for reproductive potential. And how it was used in fisheries management was often, could be influenced by other things. They were ignoring things within the reproductive potential that could actually influence SSB in a way that, what am I saying? Not a good kickoff. That basically SSB was inappropriate as it was used in stock-to-recruit relationships. So lots of scientists then ran off and came up with terminologies like the total egg production. Joanne has a paper on it, well, quite a few papers on it. 2008 is a very obvious one. Tara Marshall described it very well in a book chapter in 2008 as well. And here we have the numbers, the proportion mature, the sex ratio, and the fecundity all coming together to create total egg production, which is probably more realistic in terms of reproductive potential than the classic SSB. And SSB in stock assessments just tends to be the numbers at age times the maturity ogive times their weight. Now, if you start talking about total egg production, you quite often bring in a range of different variables, such as length, weight, condition, atresia, skip spawning, spawning strategy, and even recent feeding, if you start talking about indeterminate spawners, of course. And the overriding concept was bring in biology. So I think Tara's paper in 1998 rightly pointed out that there was very little real biological understanding in what the stock assessors were using as SSB. They just took their little matrices, multiplied the three matrices together and got stock assessment, SSB. However, something which has been bugging us since this paper came out is that you don't want to just chuck in any old biology. Chucking in any signal may not necessarily improve what's going on. If the signal is particularly noisy, you're really in trouble, because in fact you're making the signal worse to run alongside your other tuning indices in the assessment. So I've been heavily influenced by a work by Marinelle Basson in 1999, where she looked at environmental use within stock assessment. And I think it's analogous with our reproductive work as well. And then we had a paper with Jose where we looked at the signal from fecundity and how strong that had to be before it had an influence in the stock assessment that was of value in terms of advice. And then Joanne also touched on this issue, both at her talk in Lisbon and also in the paper that came out of this. I was very pleased to hear, though, that this matter also received a lot of attention at the Fresh workshop, which unfortunately I couldn't go to in Aberdeen. And I think a lot of the people that are trying to bring the biology into the stock assessments now understand that you need to bring in high quality signals. You can't just bring in any signal because it appears to be biological. So I think that debate is really over now, and I think most people understand what's going on. Of course, us being biologists, or most of us being biologists, we love to take things further. And then we get on to things like maternal effects. And we have quite a lot of papers that come out that look at the experience of females on fecundity, total viable egg production in terms of egg quality, And there's a long list here. Unfortunately, Gudrun isn't with us, but there are plenty of others in this room who have contributed. And of course, when you go along with maternal effects, you get paternal effects as well. Ed Triple, Joanne, Richard Nash, there's plenty of other people who have all added to the debate. And all of these are valid as long as they, in my mind, they improve the signal that goes into the stock assessment. If they just add noise, I find them a bit iffy, and I think they're sort of arguing, as we say in English, how many angels are on the head of a pin. But if they add quality, if they add a signal, then I think they are extremely valid. Another thing that we've just started to look at in Imaris, and this is a little exercise by Thomas Brunel and He-Yan Piet through the MEFAPO exercise, is actually to consider things like density-dependent growth. And here we find in the red, we have an estimate of an SSB index compared to a total egg production estimate of North Sea cod and North Sea herring, where we have very clear density effects on the older fish if the population gets too high. And if you start incorporating that, it almost pulls the line between total egg production and SSB back towards the SSB. So it does really matter what factors you think about and how you incorporate things. Okay, has considering stock reproductive potential made a difference to fisheries advice? We recently did a little survey of 37 prominent IC stocks, and forgive me now, the rest of my talk is going to go very, very European. I'm very sorry for that. Of those 37 stocks, 3 included a variable maturity ogive over their whole time series. 3 had variable maturity ogives over the recent part of the time series. 31 had fixed maturity ogives over the whole time series, not a single annual variability going on at all. So I'm going to give you one of my favorite examples, North Sea cod. Here we have the ogive, despite the vast amount of work, particularly in the last 6 months, which ICs have again pumped into North Sea cod, they haven't touched the maturity ogive. And I'm so glad that the scientists who created this ogive know that 4-year-olds, 0.62% of them are mature. I think that 0.2% in there is very important, rather than 0.6. And it's fixed forever. Now, I'm not saying that this is wrong, but I'm saying I find it very, very dubious. And I think it's we're constantly talking in the North Sea about regime change and carrying capacity and the gadoid outburst. And the very concept that North Sea cod are now exactly the same as they were in the 1960s, I find very, very strange indeed. But apparently, according to ICES, of which I'm a part and very active, that is how it is. Okay, fisheries advice. I'm going to continue on the North Sea cod example. And this is the state of North Sea cod as we think it is now. And to me, when we look at this, there is an overriding problem here, and that's SSB is way too low, way too low. The stock has collapsed. Now, I'm not sure that introducing reproductive biology into the advice in this instant is really going to deal with the major problem. And the major problem is that there's not enough cod in the North Sea. But I also want to say I don't think there's a solve-all problem to this issue. We have a collection of papers that have come out recently which claim that only one factor is the reason for the lack of recovery in North Sea cod. We have Olsen et al. From the Christian Stensis School, which is suggesting that it's environment completely, and only when the zooplankton change back to how it was prior to 1985 is cod going to recover. We have Clara Ulrich's F-cubed paper, which I think is very nice, which has just come out in the ICES journal Advanced Axis, and which says that until the bycatch on cod is dealt with, cod will never recover. We have the Spears et al. Paper, which is a demographic model of cod from Mike Heath's group in Glasgow, which is claiming that cod will never recover while there is a substantial herring population in the North Sea. And then, of course, we have Peter Wright saying that, in fact, this is not one stock, it's at least 3 stocks. And this signal we see here is an amalgam of the dynamics of 3 different populations, which of course I quite sort of feel with, I'm quite empathetic to, because I work in North Sea herring mostly, which has a lot of different components doing all sorts of things. So does reproductive biology really matter in this instance? Okay, I think it does, and I'm going to show you why. This is how, up until last year, ICES judged whether a stock was doing well or not. This is the biomass, the precautionary biomass level, and quite clearly, we're well below that. But we're not just below that, we're below B lim, and this is apparently the point at which the reproductive output of North Sea cod will be impaired. B lim. We're well, and BPA is a buffer to that B lim, and we're only coming up to it. And the management objective, quite clearly for this stock, is to recover to BPA. Now, ICES is about to change its management framework, and they're now going to call it a, I'm going to get this wrong, it's probably something like a precautionary BMSY threshold or something. But still, overall policy will be it should recover to above BPA. However, I said to you that B lim is the point at which the reproductive biology of the stock is impaired, or likely to be impaired. This is B lim. Okay? Now, as reproductive biologists, even if you don't believe in stock-to-recruit relationships, where is the break point in this figure? It's certainly not down there. And this is the main advice that governs North Sea cod. To me, it's quite clear that the break point can be anywhere there. I'm going to come back to North Sea cod later when we go through some worked examples. But forgive me, I've dwelt too much on cod, and in the European context, we deal with a lot of other species which are nothing like cod. Of course, we have capelin, we have redfish, we have the pipefish, which isn't assessed at present, but is certainly around in vast numbers. We have elasmobranchs, anchovy, and one of my favorites, and I wish more people were doing work on this, we have Baltic stickleback, which apparently has really, really high biomasses. But no one's interested in it, but it'd be very interesting to try and look into that. So, are all fish like cod? No. And they're certainly not managed like cod. So we need to keep things broad, and we need to keep looking out at what's going on. And with that in mind, Joanne in 2008 gave us this paper, which I've already referred to. And on the bottom of the first graph, you see SSB against recruits, and that's the traditional American place, or in the European context, long rough dab. And then when Joanne put in a female spawning biomass, she found that things varied. When she turned that into total egg production, she found it varied even more. Now, what's quite interesting is, okay, the x-axis has changed in terms of a scale, but also the relative position of some of the years have changed. If we look at this cluster of 86 to 89, we see that it's on the right side of the breakpoint of the stock-to-recruit relationship. And then if we look at total egg productions, we see it's on the left side. So that should ring sort of alarm bells if you were a manager. If you were dealing with SSB, the stock is fine, no problem. We're not likely to impair reproductive potential. If you're talking in egg production, then actually we're on the left of the breakpoint and we're in trouble. And quite a few of you in this room, in fact, almost all of you are in this room. Oh, 2 are missing, but have this 2009 paper where you go through 8 stocks, 6 cod, 1 American place, and 1 northern hake. And here you find the picture slightly more complicated, because if you put in various different types of stock reproductive potential, spawning reproductive potential, sorry, you find that for each species, it varies. So on the left, we have the Northern Gulf cod, where you see that the recruits to the index of spawning reproductive potential, it changes depending on what you choose, whereas with Northern hake, there's almost no change. So unfortunately here, despite this paper being quite wonderful in what it's attempting to do, and its analysis, I think, is quite robust, they don't have the definitive message that you need to include reproductive potential for the sake of management. And we go to even more detail, and this is by Adrian Reinsdorp, Cindy Van Dam, and Peter Withams. And here we have the total egg production for North Sea Place. This is a beautifully elegant piece of work, I think. They start off with the standard ICES female only, although ICES doesn't do standard female only, but they're assuming all the other variables and parameters are kept the same. Female only fixed maturity index, and that's the first one at the top. And then you add, to make it even more complex and to cope with some of the issues of discarding, you don't add weights at age. You taken from the standard assessment, you put in Bonverter-Lamphey growth curves with year effects and cohort effects, and then that brings that down in terms of total egg production. And as you can see here, we've got a scaling. We're not really getting any dramatic change. Then you add in variable maturity, which is perhaps one of the easier ones. And I heard Joanne this week say that it was the factor that had the most influence on the reproductive potential. And then they've gone even further, and they've coped with maternal effects by putting in repeat spawners and recruitment spawners. And it's down in that right-hand corner. You can't actually see it because it is so close, but there's actually 20% difference between the variable maturity and the recruit and repeat spawners. And that's actually quite important because prior to that, they're very, very similar. So it would suggest in recent years things have changed. And there, it isn't a scaling mechanism, it actually changes the trend. So I have another bugbear, which is there such a thing as a fixed stock to recruitment relationship anyway? And all those studies that just whizzed past have helped me to come to the conclusion, no, there isn't. And I think that the people who work on reproductive biology have a lot to offer the stock assessment world by telling them again and again and again, there is no such thing as a fixed stock to recruit relationship. I heard Peter Wright say it earlier. But, as I showed you already, it forms the basis for almost all of the management approaches, certainly in the ICES context. So the whole concept I have found of the precautionary approach of looking for the breakpoints in those relationships, I find very dubious indeed. So that's dealing with stocks that are in a very, very poor shape, and you're trying to look to see if you can get them to recover to a certain point, usually what we consider the breakpoint in this non-existent stock-to-recruit relationship. But are all stocks collapsed? That's the question. No, is the answer. This is a paper in Press by Trevor Branch, and Neil Starn and John Pope also have one very similar, which is coming out in ICES journal very soon as a communication, which point out that some of the Boris Worm calculations are a little iffy, and in fact the majority of stocks are not collapsing and are not heading down to 2048, but we all know that story and we've seen the recent papers about that. But we're not looking to try and rebuild stocks back up to a precautionary biomass point for the sake of collapse. What we're trying to do is find targets for sustainable exploitation. And it now appears that Europe has finally joined the rest of the world and has finally agreed, thanks to the Johannesburg Declaration, that we're going to go for MSY. We're going to join ICAT, we're going to join NOAA, we're going to join the Canadians, who have been thinking about MSY for a lot longer, although, forgive me, Europe was thinking about it earlier as well, but we dumped it in the 1990s. And MSY estimation is affected by lots of different factors. It's sensitive to growth, maturity, fishing selectivity, productivity, well, which is also partly the steepness issue. And all of those things are heavily influenced, some of those things are heavily influenced by the science that goes on with the scientists in this room. I find it quite funny that if you look up MSY on the web, you end up with Louis Armstrong Airport in New Orleans, because apparently that's the airport code for it. But the take-home message here is that to do MSY properly, you need to consider a lot of things other than what are the outcomes of your standard stock assessment now. I have a running battle, not a battle, I have a running debate with my industry who want to change the selectivity of the place beam trawl fleet in the North Sea in their response to MSY. And they're right, in my mind, to take that approach. But ICES just thinks, no, we're going to run with the current selectivity and push it forward. And the same kind of argument could, in fact, be related to reproductive factors. So a group of us, led by the quite wonderful Laurie Kell, thought we would bring some biology into some of our favorite stocks. And it's North Sea cod, North Sea plaice, and North Sea herring. Now, the cod example you've already seen. When we added some biology and created a TEP from literature and just put it in, you can see here we had a very different story in terms of total egg production from the cod population. With the plaice, we took Adrian Reinsdorp's data and put that into our framework, and we came out with a similar kind of picture from Adrian, but we showed that perhaps the decline was worse than considered by the ICES stock assessment. And we were very pleased to find, my pet little stock, North Sea herring, we had so much biology in it already, and we don't have sex ratio issues, because herring are always 50-50 male and female, that in fact, SSB worked perfectly well, and in fact, we didn't need to do anything. It was total egg production and SSB overlaid each other very, very well indeed. So that's the kind of thing. But this is still showing that there's a difference, but it doesn't show that it matters. And no manager is going to take heed of what we have to say unless it matters. So we went the next stage and we looked at the stock to recruit plots, and this is where we began to get very worried. With the herring, almost no change. As you can see on the right-hand side there, our perception of the stock, and these are lowest smoothers, they're not stock to recruit relationships at all. We've just smoothed through the data. In terms of the plaice, we sort of were suggesting that, in fact, the density effects on plaice were much stronger than we previously thought, which is quite kind of interesting because North Sea plaice at the moment is rocketing, absolutely rocketing. So we might be heading back into this area where, according to the total egg production estimate, we might be, in fact, suppressing production. But the one that made us all scratch our heads, and I've spoken to people in this room about it as well, is North Sea cod. We got a very, very different picture. And in fact, we got no break point whatsoever. We almost got a line going straight up, which I'm happy to talk to anybody about afterwards. It does pose major issues in terms of management and in terms of what you want to achieve if you want a recovered cod stock in the North Sea. What is a recovered cod stock? Some people have said that's only been driven by the gadoid outburst, but Laurie's looked into it more carefully. And in fact, the gadoid outburst doesn't actually, if you take those data out, you still end up with just a straight line. So the other way to do it, or to see if it makes a difference, is to look at potential targets using MSY. And here we have FMSY, using the TEP and the classic ICES response, and these are close to the official, no they're not, sorry, tell a lie. They are we use the same method with determining FMSY with the classic ICES stock assessment and with the total egg production. And these ICES ones are different from the formal ICES ones which have been agreed last year or are about to be agreed this year. And as you can see, as expected, you end up with different targets if you take total egg production into account. For North Sea cod, lower. And I know the multi-species people are saying that the FMSY for cod should in fact be higher than the single species one, but we're actually suggesting if you look at TEP, it should be even lower, at 0.15. Also interestingly, the yield for cod, the target yield under equilibrium MSY, and I've just told you I don't believe in equilibria, but there we are, is apparently double the size if you calculate it on the basis of the TEP. But in terms of yield, there was no major impact in terms of plaice and herring. Now, there are other studies which have begun to look at MSY and have begun to look at bringing reproductive biology into the advisory system. And it's very hard to find these papers because they are there, but there aren't many of them. And I already mentioned the Morgan et al. One, with most of you as co-authors, from 2009. Hilario has one on the northern hake, which is very interesting. It says you're actually more likely to know what's going on if you include reproductive biology, but in fact, it may not matter to management whether you know what's going on or not, which is a kind of not really the kind of message that everybody wants, because we want to know what's going on, say it's better, and yes, it makes a difference. Well, I asked Hilario, and he said, well, yeah, it doesn't really improve management greatly. And then we've got others. There's ongoing work with Brunel, Kell, and Fortnum and Mason et al. But we need more, much, much more. Have we delivered the lockout punch? Have we, as reproductive biologists and stock assessors, really persuaded people that including more reproductive biology helps in terms of management? Let's be honest. All of us have our favorite little causes and we want to campaign for them. But we have never really shown that it's better for fisheries management to include more realism in reproductive biology. I can't find a single paper that really shows why people should be listening to what we've got to say. We need high-impact proof if people are to take us seriously and listen to us. And I personally also feel I need proof to be able to lobby for it myself. In my heart, I feel we should be including more reproductive biology. I'm a biologist. But if I was sitting there with a man from the ministry and asking for more money to include more reproductive biology, I actually would be on dodgy ground if I said to him, I had evidence it's going to make a difference. Because I think we haven't, as yet, so to date, come up with anything that says yes, 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 include it. Just to finish with, the future of fisheries management, certainly in Europe, is about to change. And I'm going to show you here the European Marine Strategy Framework Directive. It's been alluded to in some other talks. And here we have 11 descriptors of good environmental status. And these are going to govern the marine policy in Europe. And one of them, oh, wrong way down. And one of them, one descriptor focuses on commercial fish stocks. Now, this descriptor has three things for good environmental status of commercial fish stocks. One is based on fishing activity, one is based on reproductive capacity, and one, which was already mentioned today, is based on population, age, and size distribution. But I'm not going to look at number 3. I want you to look at number 2. What's wrong? What's going on here? Reproductive capacity equals SSB. It's there. It's a legal document. It states it really clearly. Does this look familiar? I think it's time that someone read Tara's paper. Okay. SSB still rules. Thank you very much.